Great. Well, this week we've had several questions, and the first one I wanted to ask you that came in. Someone had a question about wondering, first of all, if you had read James Jordan's I think it's the case against Western civilization, in his proposals in there, and they want to get your take on that. Things like Hebrew versus Latin, music being on par with literature.
Right.
Those kinds of things. So, tell us your take on some of that.
Yeah, the backdrop of that I'd like to preface all this by saying that Jim Jordan's a friend of mine. I respect him highly. I don't agree with him on everything, and this is one of the areas where we just don't agree. His case against Western civilization is a very provocative and very good thing to engage with, because many of the things that he's pointing to, I'm right with him, but I don't think where we don't agree is how you tackle, how you respond to that problem. So Jim's case against Western civilization is a case, I think, the thing that he's after is he's trying to make a case against sort of principled syncretism, where you have the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian stuff all mushed together. And Jim's a strict biblicist, as am I, and so I want to be done with the syncretism too. So there's a type of classicism that wants to have a great books education, and the great books education is all about having the great conversation, as Mortimer Adler put it, and you never really come down to with answers, right?
Right.
Well, the Bible presents fundamental, foundational, absolute answers, and the point of education is not to get caught up into a perpetual dialogue. So I agree with Jim on that. The places where I would differ, and I responded in one place in my book, The Case for Classical Christian Education. I respond to Jim's argument in a brief place in that book, but I would basically summarize my thoughts in two categories. One's a theological response and one's a practical response. The theological response is the Hebraic world that God gave his first revelation to us in the Old Testament was a Hebraic world which God interrupted and gave us part two in Hellenistic categories. So whose idea was it to move from Hebrew to Greek? So if we went from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English, well, whose idea was it to make the first move?
Yeah.
Well, it was God's, moving from Hebraic thought forms to Hellenistic thought forms. Now, the metaphor for that is in Paul's epistle to the Romans in chapter 11. You've got the Hebraic stock, the Abrahamic tree, the olive tree, which is Israel. And then God cuts out a bunch of Hebraic branches and grafts in a bunch of wild olive branches, because he wanted to spice it up a bit. He wanted us to have to assimilate and deal with new issues, new categories, and so forth. I agree with Jim that we ought not to. The way to do that is not by syncretism, not by capitulating, but there has to be some sort of, I think, accommodation and interaction with subsequent developments. That's part of how biblical history, biblical theology unfolds. Then the second argument I would make is simply a pragmatic argument, which would be no good if there weren't the theological argument. But the pragmatic argument is you play cards with the hand that you're dealt. If I want to be an education reformer and I want to rebuild the ruins and I want to get us involved, I'm not going to be able to do it if I'm trying to get everybody whipped up about having their kids learn Hebrew. It's just not going to work. Latin and Greek, and then to Hebrew is the better way to go. You start from where you are, not from where you should have been. We've got a Roman alphabet. We are much more familiar with Latin in our history and culture. That's something that's recoverable. And when we recover Latin, which is accessible, that's a step toward recovering Greek. And that's I think you're far more likely to recover Hebrew and music and all of those things the way we're doing it. So I want to start from where we are, not from where we should have been.
Yeah, it would how about in terms of addressing, because it seems to me that some of and I haven't actually read the book, but I've heard some of the arguments, and would you want to address the and you sort of already alluded to this, but the pro-Hebraic position of Western of the Western tradition.
Yes, that's one of the things that I think Jim would agree with me on, and that is one of the problems with doing the Hellenistic Greco-Roman fan club is that the contributions of biblical theology and biblical categories are frequently disparaged, minimized, and sidelined. There are many people who talk about democracy and representative government that don't recognize the Hebrew contribution to that at all. It's all supposed to have come from Athens. Well, some of it did, but there was a huge contribution made by the Hebrews.
And bringing it down to sort of like a practical, I guess, illustration. I mean, I've heard this. I've heard things like this. So I'll just kind of use an example. When people say, "Look, I'm not into the classical education thing because I want my kids to learn Hebrew,"
right?
I'm not sure about the whole classical education thing because I'm into, I believe liturgy is important in the Psalms, and I'm just throwing up things that I've heard before.
Right.
I want my kids to get a more liturgical education, liturgical based education. It seems a bit of a dichotomy.
Yeah, it's. I think it's a false dichotomy, and it's like people saying, "Well, we want to pull our kids out of your school because we don't want to emphasize academics. We want to emphasize character."
Right.
Well, I'd say, what makes you think that academics isn't a character issue?
Right.
Academics is a character issue. Your little Johnny or Billy needs to learn to work harder. And that's a character. That's a character issue. With this, many of the people who are saying we want to emphasize music more, we want to emphasize liturgy more, I'm saying, okay, I'm sold. So do I. But these suggestions could not have arisen, I'm convinced, without the resurgence of classical Christian education. So it's as though some people are saying we need to do this, and I would argue I don't think you can do that from scratch. I think you've needed the infrastructure of classical Christian education, and the project of recovering these things has given you some big ideas. Well, let's recover more. And to that, I'd say, yes, amen. Let's recover more than we've recovered thus far. But don't kick the ladder away. After you've climbed up this high, don't kick the ladder away. We need to live up to what we've attained. Keep what we've attained, and then do more. I honestly don't believe that these other things would be even in the game had it not been for the resurgence of classical Christian education.
Sure. And how about, would you also say, I mean, that was exactly what I was wondering, that you believe that it was a false dichotomy, but also that it's kind of an abstract thing, because it's a nice abstract false dichotomy, because I think, and would you say, I mean, you look at, for instance, kids that go to St. Andrews, Hebrews on the Hebrews on the menu. There's no one. In other words, it's not the classical education world is not running away from this kind of thing.
Right. Nobody is saying Hebrew's bad, don't learn it.
Right.
Right. Nobody's saying that.
Right.
I think it's great to learn Hebrew.
Right.
It's great to learn Greek, but your brain is not like a shoebox that gets full up and now it's full and you can't do anymore.
Right.
The brain is more like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the more you can do. The more you exercise it, you're in better and better shape. So when students learn how to learn languages, we Americans think that if you learn one additional language tops, well, because then their shoebox is full. But it's a muscle. You're learning how to recover genuine learning. So in the Reformation, you had Greek scholars and Hebrew scholars, and they wrote in Latin. When Jonathan Edwards went to college, he didn't take a course in Latin. All his courses were taught in Latin.
Right.
So that was the working language, and so there's no reason to stop. There's no reason to not learn Greek, not learn Hebrew, not study. Amen, go for it. But this is part of the ladder. This is part of how we get there.
What about maybe get a little bit on a tangent here? I want to move on to some other questions, but someone says, I don't know about basically, I don't know if I want, I don't know if I want to put my kids in Logos, for instance, because, I'd like to see their, I'd like to have things shaped more by worship.
Right.
How do you respond to that?
Well, God gave us 1 day and 7 to worship. Okay, God gave us the Lord's Day, and that means 6 days out of 7, the shaping occurs. So the impetus, what we do on the Lord's Day in worship is sufficient to take us through the week. So it has nothing whatever to do with where your kids are, going to school in that way.
Right.
So it's a false dichotomy again. It's not either or.
Sure.